end-to-end PDF patterns. So I'm here today to share with you my latest pattern. It's the third pattern that I've released. I'm not wearing it because it's freezing right now in Sydney. We're going through a bit of a cold snap. I'm just wearing a molly top I saw over it, or molly dress rather, sorry. I actually have, you would have seen in the beginning clips, this one and the other two. I have them here. Sorry, I'm not wearing them. I'm literally freezing. So this is a panelled front. So see how I've done this one with the contrasting? I kind of wanted to show you that there's different panels here and you can do a little bit of colour blocking and have fun with that. So this line goes straight through the bust point and then it hits the waist, and then you've got a little flounce. Do we call this a flounce? Yeah, it's a flouncy little hem. You could also leave it off if you wanted just without the flounce. It will be a little shorter obviously. So on me, I'll put some clips, you'll be able to see me wearing it. It's hanging just above my knee. I thought it kind of looked a little cuter, making it a little shorter, but I'm a highly practical person in terms of my wardrobe, and I don't like to be walking around and being, insecure that I might flash at anyone, and I just like to feel comfortable there. So I'm 5'7", if you like it that height that you can see me wearing it, then you don't need to change anything if you're also 5'7". But if you're a little shorter than me, or you're a little taller than me, you're gonna want to adjust the pattern at the pattern cutting line just to make it shorter or longer. You can't just make it longer from the hem, because the hem needs to be the same size, or longer from the hem because the hem needs to be the same size as the flounce, otherwise it won't fit on and you might flare it out unless you do it exactly the same measurements. You could, that's fine, but yeah, it'd just probably be easier if you just cut it the lengthening shortening line. So what else can I say about it? It has these, so the back has darts. There's darts at the waist, at the front and the back, and then it has a zipper. It goes all the way to the kind of like a high back, and yeah. So I'll walk you through the steps in this tutorial of how I sewed it. I didn't quite perfectly sew this one perfectly. You can kind of see some, I guess, I don't know what you call that, you know what I'm trying to say. You can see some puckering, I guess you could say, from where I've sewn the zip in. I did put a stabilizer there, but I mean, maybe it helped a bit, but I'm not super experienced working with fabrics like this, to be honest. I kind of often work with like cottons and more easy to work with fabrics, so you know, it's not perfect, but you know, it's just a sample to sew up and see how it looks. I love the contrast. I think it's really cute. You could even make it as a top, just lengthen the bottom so you'll have a hem, or lengthen it more if you want. You'd have to flare it out a little bit if you have a sort of the hips. Also, you could just make it as a skirt. If you want to add a facing, I can show you how to do that. I'll probably do that on a little TikTok of how to make a facing for and then you can make it into a skirt. You could lengthen it, you can make it longer, you can make it shorter. Yeah, it'd be really cool to see what people make. Yeah, and you can see you can make it obviously just in one color. I've fully lined this version. In the pattern, I've just recommended that you line the top because there's so many seams in there, you don't really want them pressing against you. But because this fabric was kind of on the lighter side, I lined the skirt too. I didn't line the flounce. I only did one because you don't really need to do that. But you can see that I've lined inside here, and then I've overlocked those two pieces together and sewed them together, as well. You just can use the same pattern pieces as the skirt if you want to line it. that would be fine as well. If you've got a light fabric, you'll obviously need a little bit more fabric than the pattern suggests. And then and that fabric was from Minerva, by the way, both of those fabrics. I'll link them below as well. And this fabric is a beautiful, it's like a Brodeur Anglaise. Wow, that's the worst accent to say that. But you know what I'm trying to say. I got this fabric from Spotlight, but you can see how there's not like the puckering there because it's an easier fabric to work with. So I did line this one, obviously because then the whole thing would be sheer with the holes. I lined the whole thing again. The pink one is the only one which I've only lined to the top. You can check the pattern for the finished measurements as well. I've sort of made it that it's not super slim fitted. The pink one came out a little bit slimmer because I probably moved as I was sewing it a little bit, because I don't work with satin that often, so I'm not that expert at working with it. It's definitely a fabric that you want to use if you're a little bit more experienced. I mean, I have been sewing for like 6 years or something, but I kind of get lazy and I tend to go for the easier fabrics rather than the chiffons and the satins and all those sorts of things. But I should probably try and push myself a bit more. So for the fabric recommendations, like I've used there, like the Brodeur guys would be great. The satin would work as well. Obviously, if you're comfortable working with satin. The cotton lawns, the sort of stable fabrics, but it has a little bit of like not something too stiff, because then that flounce at the bottom will sort of just stick out. But if you could probably make it in a thicker or more sturdy or less drapey fabric if you wanted, and not do the flounce and just make it a little bit longer, and it's more of a simple sort of, I guess you could call it a work dress. You could make it out of suitings. There's a lot of things you could make it out of. Not stretchy fabric. It needs to be woven fabric. Yeah, so that's all I can think of. I'm sure there's more, but we'll get into the tutorial now. So first you need to cut out your fabric. If you are using the A4 letter version, you're going to need to piece it together. You can find the steps on page 10. Otherwise you can print out the A0 version, and then you just need to cut it out. Much easier. So I like to use these pattern weights, or they're not pattern weights, they're washers from Bunnings, but I find them really useful and handy. So just remember to cut out the vanillin shield as well when you do all that. So I'm showing you that the shiny side is the right side and the matte side is the wrong side in this case. So it's right sides together. We're going to pin the top section of the bodice to the bottom section of the bodice. And we're going to do that for the lining pieces as well, and we're going to do it for each side. And we're going to sew that with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Probably shouldn't be using pins on satin, or if you are, they have to be really sharp, good pins, which mine are not. So just a note for everyone, mistakes that I'm making here. But I wanted to use this fabric so you can see the contrast in the panels, and you could also see the right and the wrong side really easily. So I always like to sew a practice stitching on the final fabric that I'm going to use, just to make sure that the stitching and everything's going correctly and it's all lined up. So I'm going to sew that for every single one of those that we did. So you'll have 4. And again, it's a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I find that on my machine, I just move it over to the 2 mil and then I put it along the edge, and that's 1 centimeter. But measure on your machine 1 centimeter. Then you're going to make sure you press those seams open. Use some steam from the wrong side, press them open. With satin, you probably shouldn't be pressing from the right side. So now you're going to sew the front bodice, pin and sew along the middle, making sure to match the center seam lines. And you're going to do that for both the lining as well. That it's quite important that you get that middle point to line up, especially if you're using contrasting fabric, because you'll notice that. So I put a pin through mine and I match it to the other side at the 1 centimeter point, just to make sure that that's lining up. and so hopefully you'll get it correct if you do that. You can always unpick it. So again, 1 centimeter seam allowance, sew that up. And backstitch at the beginning and end. I didn't get it quite perfect. You can sort of see it's like a mil or so off, but I did my best. We're gonna move on from this. Again, press open the seam. Again, I like them open on these front pieces because it's gonna be fully lined, and then there won't be too much bulk on the side seams. Again, you probably shouldn't press that in from the top, or just be careful if you can use a pressing cloth. Now I've moved on to the back. I'm marking the darts. I put a hole in the pattern so it's easier for me to mark that top point of the dart. And then I draw with this is an erasable marker. It basically just irons and washes out. So first I match the bottom of the dart. You usually will have cut little notches in there as well, so you can match the notches up as well. And then I put a pin through, and then I see if it's matching on the back as well. So the front and the other side, that blue line, the pin goes through both sides correctly. If not, just shimmy it around, move it around. So I sew the dart. I backstitch at the end, but a better method to get the point of the dart nicer would be to sew it off to the end, and then just let the thread run off, and then tie a knot or two to keep it in place. It gets you a nicer edge. Then you're going to press the dart towards the middle, so where the zipper will be. And you're going to make sure that you repeat this for the lining as well. You're going to do all these same steps for the lining. Now you're going to pin and sew the vanillin shield. So either if you don't have this and you can't find it, but I recommend you do, you could also sew just a line of stay stitching if you like. This is better, but stay stitching is also helpful. So you're going to make sure you repeat that for the lining as well, and the back. So the front, back, armholes, necklines, all of that. So now I'm sewing the shoulders together. It's a 1 centimeter seam allowance again. The only place that's different is the armholes and the neckline. Just making sure you backstitch at the front and the back so it doesn't fall apart. Repeating for the other shoulder seam as well. I like to iron it open. You could iron it to the back, but I just thought because I'm ironing the lining as well and you're going to lay them over the top of each other, you might get a bit much bulk. But if you prefer to push them to the back, go for it. So now I have the lining and the main fabric. I'm laying the lining fabric or the main fabric over on top of each other, right sides together, so you can see the shiny sides are facing together. And then I'm pinning it around the neckline. So that includes the back as well. Now I'm going to sew this with a 6mm seam allowance, not a 1 centimeter. So it's a little bit smaller. Pivoting when you get to that shoulder, it's just a little bit easier if you pivot. You can just take it slow when you're going around the curves. Curves can be a little tricky sometimes, especially if you're working with the satin. They might, move around a little bit. Backstitch at the end and front as well. So this is me just cutting out little triangles. These just help it lay flat when you turn it through. Every time you do a curve seam, you want to cut little snips in it like this, every maybe 2 centimeters, maybe about 1.5 centimeters, depends how curved it is, I guess. Then I've turned it through to the right side, so now the shiny sides are facing, and I'm pressing it flat. That will just help it all sit nice. So you're just giving it a really good press, lots of steam. You want to make sure the lining is on the inside, steam up your camera. So now we want to understitch that neckline. So understitching is just when you stitch the seam allowance to the lining side or the facing side. It depends if you have a facing or a lining. It's just to make it so that it won't poke through to the right side when you're wearing the garment. So you're going to make sure that the seam allowance is facing towards the side that you want to make the lining. You can see here, I've got a little bit of that Vilene shield left over. So now I just turned it back so it was the other way again, so right sides together, because I want to do the armholes. So I just pin them together, shiny sides together in this case. And again, I'm going to sew it with a 6mm seam allowance, not a 1 centimeter seam allowance, 6mm. Back stitching at the end and the front. So next you're going to pull the back pieces through to the front through the shoulders. It might be a little bit of a squeeze. It'll be easier if it's a lightweight fabric. If it's slightly heavier, it's going to be a little bit harder. But yeah, again, that's why I don't really recommend a heavyweight fabric for this project. Might take a little bit of shimmying to get through. Then you're going to want to press that flat from the right side. You also wanted to, I should have mentioned, clip the curve before you turn it through, like you did on the neckline. And so we're going to try and understitch the armholes. You're not going to be able to get completely up to the top. Just make sure that the seam allowance is facing the right side that you want it to face, and make sure every time you're understitching that you're understitching on the lining side or the same side. So moving on to attaching the side seams together of the lining and the back. So you can see I just opened it up like that for the front, and I've opened the back up, and then I'm matching the armholes. And then I'm going to pin one back to one and one back to the other front. So there's 2 fronts, 2 backs. You're just pinning them along the side seams, like you would if you just had one, but you've got a lining. So you've got one hanging out the other edge. It's kind of a little complicated to explain, but make sure you match up the seams. The armhole seam is the main thing. You just want that to be even on both sides. Then you're going to sew it with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And then you're going to repeat the exact same thing for the other side. So now I've done it for both. You can see, probably gave it a little bit of a press. Obviously forgot to record that. Moved on to the back skirt. So I've marked the darts. I find that if I make a little hole in the pattern where the dart head is, then I put a little dot, and then I just match up that to the dot, and then I can draw the dart more easily. So it's the same as the darts you did on the front. It's just you're doing them on the skirt now. Again, you can sew it where you back stitch at the end, but a better method would be to tie it off at the end rather than back stitching like I do here. So it's just a skinny little dart. It's nothing too intense. And you're going to repeat that for the back as well. So the front and the back both have darts, And you're gonna, if you're lining it, you're gonna have to repeat this again for the lining pieces. But if you're not lining it and you're just lining the bodice, then you're good to go. So I ironed the darts towards the middle, I believe, and the front iron. So next you want to overlock the skirt pieces. I've overlocked them after I've sewn it on, but it would be easier if you had done it before. I just didn't, think very straight when I was doing this. So now you're going to match the side seams. There should be a little notch to match, but make sure everything's lining up. This is going to be sewn with the 1 centimeter seam allowance, not the 6 mil, because it is the side. And then I iron it open. I just found that easier because if you are lining the skirt, there will be a bit much bulk, and when you're attaching it to the flounce, you also make sure that you iron the back, center back, sew the center back, because to the notch point, because that's where the zip is going to go, and you're going to want that to be attached when you sew the flounce, otherwise the flounce won't fit. So now I am sewing or attaching the bodice to the skirt. So you're going to match the side seams, then you're going to match the darts at the back, make sure that they're aligning, because they should align roughly, well, not roughly, they should be correct. Then I matched so then you're going to sew that with a 1 centimeter seam allowance all the way along. Make sure you're not pushing the dart head the opposite way that it was ironed, just make sure it's the way that it was ironed. So now we're moving on to the flounce. I'm just making sure that I've marked all my notches here. I obviously forgot to before, but those are key just when you're attaching it to the skirt, and you know which flounce is for the front and which flounce is for the back. So I pinned right sides together, the flounce, on both sides, and then sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I also overlocked them separately. You could have done that previously before, and then I ironed them out as well. So I align those seam lines with the edges of the skirt first, and then you can pin the notches to make sure that those align. And then that's sewn with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Just go a bit slow when you're doing this, because you can sort of see that when you sew a flounce, it can be a little bit tricky because you're sort of almost easing in this fabric to the edge. And just make sure everything's lying flat like I was doing there. So I liked to stabilize the zipper a little bit with some interfacing about 1 centimeter thick. It was an attempt to sort of help it from puckering. I probably needed to change my needle as well. So I like to iron out the zipper just to make the teeth open up a little bit more. It's just easier to get into them. So now I'm pinning in the zipper, as you can see. So what I like to do, just so I don't get confused, is I have a look at my garment, have a look what's going on. I place the zipper the way that it would be, and then I twist it so that the teeth are not facing towards that middle seam, they're facing towards the inside of the garment, I guess you could say. And the head of the teeth is basically just jutting right at the top there. Make sure you don't pin this to the lining as well, otherwise this will be a little bit messed up. So I like to sew one side first. I'm using the invisible zipper foot. A lot of people would recommend that you sew a line of stitching with just a regular foot or a zipper foot down the middle so it's in place, and then go in with that zipper foot, but I've done a lot of these and I'm also just probably was being a little bit lazy here. So I must have forgot to film the bit where I flipped this lining towards the inside, so then the right sides are facing, so you can see that's the matte side and that's the zipper, and that's where I'm attaching the zipper. Here's the other side. This is for the lining so that it will be on the inside of the garment. I like to use the not invisible zipper foot, but just the regular zipper foot. So if you're not lining it like you are here, I like to fold the raw edge up and make sure the seam allowance is also folded up for where the skirt is attached. And then from the right side, you're going to sew in the ditch. So in the ditch is where you sew in that middle seam. You sew right in the middle there. It can be a little bit hard to do, but I sort of spread apart the fabric a little bit. And then you can't really see it from the front there. Like, it's quite hard to see, especially if you're using the right color. Finally, so now you're on to the last step, which is hemming. The seam allowance in the little flounce is 5mm, so you can either overlock that bottom edge and then fold it up by 5mm, or you can use a rolled hem foot. If you're using a satin or something like that, it would probably be recommended. I think I decided to mesh the two together, which was a mistake. I do not know what I was thinking here. But yeah, like I said, you can iron it up and then just do a little baby little hem, sew it from the top, which I would recommend if you're using just a cotton or something, but if you're using a satin, then I would recommend using a rolled hem foot. Don't overlock it first, that is incorrect. It's much more bulky and hard to do. So, your dress is finished. If you make one of these and you'd like to share it on Instagram or TikTok, definitely tag me. I'd love to see it. And thank you for watching.